I spoke from the same dais, and that was also on land acquisition. But the difference from what I spoke earlier and today is, earlier I talked about the act that was old, and that act is repealed, and now we have the new act. The title of new act, I'm sure most of you must be knowing by now because it's very important legislation in the Indian context. The title of new act is Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition and Resettlement Rehabilitation Act of 2013. In fact, I had my slides, but I did not bring because Mehul said it would be better if we speak without the slide, PPT. So this is the new act, and I in fact deliberately have chosen to speak on the new act for two reasons. One, I think in times to come, of course it is too early to conclude, probably the new act would contribute the sustainability development for the simple reason that there is a provision which says the natural resources, particularly the land resources, would be used very judiciously in the development projects in general or the infrastructure development in particular. The other reason I thought I must talk about this new act, I feel there is some kind of relevance or linkage between the CSR, the corporate social responsibility, and the element of rehabilitation and resettlement, particularly the rehabilitation related to the livelihood practices, the income restoration activities, the skill upgradation of the people who are affected because of the land acquisition in various projects. So now it is mandatory not only for the government but also for the private sectors, and also the PPP project, the element of rehabilitation is very much an integral part of the land acquisition. So these are two reasons I thought I must talk about the new act, the new legislation, which to my understanding would probably bring about a sea change in containing, controlling, regulating the poverty, the impoverishment that has happened over the decades, more so in the post-independent era. If you see the data of UN of last year only, they say in post-independent India, with which even our human rights group also agrees, that in post-independent India, about 60 to 65 million people have been displaced. I am going to talk about the people who are displaced because of the infrastructure development projects in various sectors in the country. And the fact remains, probably Professor Behura would agree with me, the Vice Chancellor from Orissa, there are also studies in the data that suggest that most of these people have not been resettled, not have been rehabilitated. So this is one of the reasons I thought probably in this international conference, this act or this legislation would be of very, very important to talk about. And friends, I am going to talk about mainly as to why do we need this act. That's number one. Secondly, what it deals with, what are the contents into the act, and third, how this is going to be implemented, because implementation, especially in the Indian context, is a major issue. And lastly, of course, I would be touching upon which are the major issues as far as this new legislation is concerned. So when we talk about why new act, I'm sure people who are really working with the development projects in different sectors would agree with the fact the way people have been displaced, the way the very eminent domain or the public purpose is being used in India, it's sufficient to conclude the fact that there have been various agitations, movements, reasonments by the people. They were not willing to part away their land for the simple reason that they were not compensated. And over the years, we have also witnessed that there have been lot of delays, lot of cost overruns leading to the cost of projects. And of course, you could also talk about it when you really make the presentation. So there are ample evidences to suggest the fact that there has been a realization for a long time that this British colonial draconian kind of act which we have had in the so far need to be repealed, and it is repealed rightly for the simple reason that there were public concerns, but at the same time, as the Chief Secretary has talked about this morning, there is a need to have the growth. There is a need to have development. There is a need to, of course, strike to the development with the environment and social requirements. So the necessity was felt for a long time, and in 2013 we have had this new act which is commenced from January 1st, 2014 onwards. When you talk about this act, I would just touch upon, I would not go into the greater details. It has some salient features. One of the important feature is, earlier there was compensation only for the people who are affected because of the land acquisition. Now this act says that resettlement and rehabilitation is an integral part of the land acquisition. This act also recognizes the fact people who are the title holders, so far they only had the entitlements, but it also says that those who are the livelihood losers, those who are dependent on the agriculture, land for their survival, for their sustenance, they also become they also have the entitlement for the compensation, and it includes all those who are the non-title holders also. Especially if you talk about the indigenous people, the tribals, as the scenario exists, countrywide it is very difficult to prove the title. They have the customary rights, there are other problems also. So this act takes into consideration all those issues, and it says very clearly that not only the title holders, but also those who are the non-title holders living in the project area for preceding 3 years, they have the entitlement and they should be given the compensation. So the other point, as you see from the title itself, there is a lot of focus on the transparency, which I would be talking about little later. But then I think it's very important to highlight here about the whole concept of consent. Earlier, particularly by the private sector, and also the projects which are under the PPP modality, yes, land was purchased and the project was implemented. But in this case, what it says is, a state will decide what would be the area, threshold area, and based on that threshold area, again you have to go for the acquisition of land. So if there is a land acquisition, that land acquisition, especially for the PPP, I think it is 70% of the affected families should give their consent, and for the private sector, 80% of affected families should give the consent, without which you cannot have the project. There is a demerit. Demerit with this provision, probably it will take more time. And still you may not be sure whether all the 80% and 70% families are going to give the consent. But at the same time, if you really see the advantage of this provision is, you will have a stronger element of community participation, a stronger component of the consultation with the people. There will be sense of ownership, and the kind of problems which we have had in the past in terms of alienation, in terms of resentment, probably that would not be there. Compensation, I think it's very important to mention here. It was realized for a long time that whatever the amount given, more in the form of sort of monetary compensation, was not sufficient enough. In fact, the people whose land was acquired and in turn money was given, that money was used most of the time in unproductive, uneconomic activities, that ultimately resulted into kind of impoverishment of the people. And as I said earlier, if you see the figures, of course the underreported figures, about 60 to 65 million people who were displaced, about 80% of them, 40% were the tribals and 40% were the Dalits. So most of these people who are already poor, not in a very good economic situation, there were cases of the further impoverishment in that scenario. But now it says that there is need to give the enhanced compensation. And enhanced compensation here would mean in the rural areas. I am sure you must have come across this statement many times through the media. It has to be 4 times in the rural areas and 2 times in the urban areas. Again, on this, of course, the amount is raised, it is enhanced, but still there are various views. If you talk in terms of the federation, the commerce, industry and all that, they are of the view probably the cost will be too high. But at the same time, if you see it from the perspective of civil society, the NGOs, they are also of the opinion that the base, the benchmark, which is the registration, remains the same. So even if you give the 4 times, probably it may not be the replacement value, it may not match the market value in order to compensate the people. Another important provision in this is there used to be situations where most of the litigations, disputes used to go to the civil court, and civil court would take number of years after the years people are going, yet the cases are not resolved. And in this new act, you have the provision of dedicated authority, and that authority will you just tell me 5 minutes before I have time. I have another 5 minutes. Okay. Very important to mention here, in India, you just look at the history of land acquisition. In most of the cases, the administration, district collector has used the provision of urgency, the under section 17, wherein within no time land will be acquired, and even if people are not willing to part away, there is a provision, some 80% amount will be either deposited in the bank and land will be taken. Now in this new act, all kinds of, the authority, the legitimate power which district collector had passed in terms of land acquisition is no more available, no more accessible. There is no urgency provision except 3 important situations. One is for the defense of India, for the national security of the country, and third, because of the natural calamities, if there is an emergency, one can go for the urgency provisions, for which again 75% more of the market value has to be given to the people who are affected. Now when it comes to the question of transparency, there is a whole lot of process and procedure which is being defined, which is being explained and elaborated at a different levels. You find there is a hearing, there is a disclosure, there is a consultation of people. If there are disputes, they can approach the authorities. So all that takes into consideration the element of transparency. Institutional structure, of course, it is little different than what it was so far. Only the district collector was one important key element for the entire process of land acquisition, but here now you have national level, provision of national monitoring committee, state level, as I said, the land acquisition and resettlement authority, project level also R&R committee, and there is a provision of appointing the administrator for R&R, then of course collector and commissioner. So many new positions have come up. Now here comes the question whether and how much time will it take in order to really implement the act. That is the other side, which of course it will be known when the policy is implemented, but certainly it will have its positive as well as negative implications. See, lastly, I would like to talk about the benefits. There are 4 schedules. The schedule 1 under this act talks in terms of all detailed provision of compensation for the people who are affected because of any development projects, their land is acquired. Then second, it talks about various R&R benefits, resettlement and rehabilitation benefits, including land for land. Of course, the size is only 1 acre for the general population and 2.5 acres if it happens to be the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe people. Then there is a provision of housing units. Then 20% developed land if the land acquired is for the urbanization or urban development program. The choice of employment, one time 5 lakhs rupees or some kind of annuity in the form of 2000 rupees per month for 20 years, subsistence grant, resettlement allowance and other types of assistance with a focus on special assistance to the vulnerable groups, including the disabled, about which there was a presentation this morning, and of course there is a special provision in terms of the benefits, R&R benefits to scheduled caste and scheduled tribes. Here it's very important to mention, and I think it again, it's something which is in the ambit of the CSR, corporate social responsibility. Schedule 3 talks in terms of some 25 basic amenities and infrastructure facilities in the resettlement colonies. There are two situations. One is the project area, another is the resettlement area. So in the resettlement area, there is a provision of providing such facilities not only to the people who are relocated elsewhere, but also it takes into account the requirements, the needs of the community, which is termed and known as the host community. So that way, I think when you really extend the benefit to the people who are already living there, I think this is something which is very close to CSR. Then there are, in fact, in India, there are about total 16 legislations, 16 legislations acts under which land acquisition takes place for various projects at different sectors. And in this fourth schedule of this act, there are 13 acts related to the land acquisition. As of now, they are exempted, but it also says very clearly that within a year's time, this act would be applicable for all those 13 acts also. I'm sure, and I think it's just 1 minute last. This Food Security Act, I think there is a semblance between the Food Security Act and the Land Acquisition Act, and it says very clearly that the multi-cropped irrigated land will not be acquired except some exceptional situations, again at some percentage at the district level, state level, which state will decide, and in case it is acquired, then you have to invest for developing the wasteland in order to ensure that the requirement of food security is really not compromised. But this also says that for the linear projects, this provision would not be applicable. Lastly, I would just like to touch upon that there are still some issues, and what I could say is cost is one issue of people are talking about. Timeline. Earlier act, of course, it has its lot of flaws, the bottlenecks, but the time taken was maximum 3 years. And I think in this case, the time is raised by about 1.5 years to 2 years time. So time is another issue. Then litigation issues, because there is a provision of social impact assessment, then that report will be approved or recommended by the expert group. They will say that it is for the public cause, they will say it is for the public purpose, and there is no land available, it is following the minimum land acquisition requirement, so and so forth. But still it is for the appropriate government to decide whether the project will be implemented or not. So on these circumstances, on these issues, there will be a lot of scope for leading to litigation issues. And of course, I think it is just commence. Time would be the best factor to determine whether the project is really successful or not. With these words, thank you very much.